Today's daf is Mem Gimel, and we'll begin here on Mem Beis Amid Beis with Omar Le Abaye Rav Shmuel Bar Rav Yehuda, which if you see the Tosfos Dibra Maschil Ad Hot Chelta Hechi Tzav Isule. How do you dye the thread that you're going to use for Tcheles? How do you dye it? Omar Le, so Rav Shmuel responds, My sinon dam chilazon. So we bring the dam of the chilazon. The Torah requires that the dam that is used to dye a thread of tchelis has to be from chilazon, and then we mix it b'samamonim with different kinds of herbs. For a minu lahu biyora, then we put them all into a big large pot and we boil up the pot. Martachina lahartiach means to boil up. V'shaklinen purta bebeyusa. We take a little bit of dye, and we're not going to put it into the yoreh, but into this pot, but rather we're going to take it out of the pot and put it into an eggshell. Vita'aminon lehu bi'udra. Now the word vita'imnon usually means te'ima, which means to taste something, but here it's used in a different context. And what it means is to examine. So we can examine now this dye after we remove it from the yoreh and put it into the beitzah, and we're going to put a piece of cloth into this beitzah to absorb the dye. And then, after putting the dye into the eggshell and adding some sort of wool, like maybe a piece of cloth or a wad of wool, kalinin leili utra, we have to burn that wad of wool. So we're going to first check to see if everything is okay and if the wool absorbed that dye, and then the test is successful. And at that point, we're going to see exactly why in a second, we burn that wool that has absorbed the dye. So the Gemara explains this with Shmamino Tlas, with deriving three conclusions. First, Shmamino Te'ima Psula. In other words, we can't take that wool that we used for the test, that we put into that small amount of dye in the eggshell, and then it absorbed the dye of the eggshell, which means if the experiment was successful, then what we have here is a piece of wool that has absorbed the dye of tchelis, and we can make threads out of it. No, we cannot make threads out of it. And the reason we can't make threads out of it is going to be explained now in the second of the three shmaminos, to be'inan tzviyah l'shma, because although we successfully dyed this piece of wool with tcheles, but nevertheless that dyeing was done for the purpose of a test and not for the purpose of the mitzvah of tzitzis. And we require what's called tzviyah l'shma. We mean that the dyeing of the blue color of the wool has to be done for the sake of tzitzis. Ushmamina, the third thing is that te'ima pasla. That means that we can't put this dye that's in the eggshell back into the yoreh, because that dye is now disqualified for use as tcheles, to dye a thread of tcheles, and therefore it will get mixed up with all the rest of the dye that we prepared in the vat, and it will passel the rest of the dye. Let me just see if he adds anything here. No, I was hoping he would say something about min b'mino in a butter, but he doesn't. Anyway, let's go on. So now the Gemara wants to know, why do you call it three different halachas? It's really just two. Hainu te'ima psula, hainu tzviyah l'shma. Rav Ashi, Ma tam ka'omar. I'm explaining why is it that the te'ima is psula, and I can't use that wool that was used for a test to absorb the dye and now make threads of tchelis out of it. Ma tam tima psula mishum deve'ina tviya lishma, because the dyeing has to be done for the sake of the mitzvah of tzitzis. Ketanoi. The Gemara thinks that this last shmamina, namely that te'ima psula, is a subject of controversy amongst the Tanoim, and we'll see the brisa begins with Rabbi Chanina. Te'ima psula, that's what we saw until now. Mishum shenemar klil tcheles. Divrei Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel, and he derives from the pasuk klil tcheles that the dye has to be done for kalil. Kalil means totally, means completely. And the dye itself, right, is no longer fit to be used to dye tcheles threads because it doesn't have a full strength of the pigment of the chilas and of the dye. Rabbi Yochanan ben Dahabi Omer, however, he disagrees and he says, "Afilu mara sheni sheba kosher." Right? He can use it a second time around, and even though if he uses it a second time around, it doesn't have the same full strength pigment, but it's sufficient. And we're going to derive that, and fish v'tches, and we're going to derive that conclusion from a drasha in a pasuk, shenemar ushni tolas. Again, this pasuk is in a totally different context, and it has to do with red woolen thread that will be used for the Big Day Kohen Gadol, the Big Day Kahuna. But in any event, since the Torah compares the tcheles and the red thread, because they mention the same pasuk in Shmos Perek Chafei, therefore we derive the word ushni, which means that you can have a second dyeing and use it a second time. Tana Rabbana, we learned in the Brisa, tcheles ein la bedika. There's no way of checking and examining and determining whether or not this is real tcheles, or maybe it's kala elon, maybe it's indigo. And when you buy tcheles, meaning strings of tcheles, you have to buy it from an expert. Tefillin yesh lahem bedika. Tefillin, you want to know whether the sofer added a letter or subtracted a letter, is then we could examine it. We just look at the text and we know what the Masorah is. We know whether or not it's valid or not valid. Ve'enil kachin, nevertheless, we don't buy tefillin, elamina mumche, but sfarim mevzunas yesh lam bedika minil kachin mikolon. You don't need a mumche when you buy sfarim in mezuzas. And this is going to have to do, as we'll soon see, with the halach of ibud and the requirement of lishma in ibud in preparing the hides for tefillin, which is a requirement that doesn't apply in the cases of Sifrei Torah and mezuzas. But in any event, the Gemara asks right away, Tchelis ein la bedika? How do you open this brisa with the words that there's no bedika? Vaha, we just finished learning that Rabbi Yitzchak Brei, Rabbi Yeshua Badikle, he would test out the tcheles and determine if it's authentic tcheles. Maisi magvia gilo mai. Oh, so I made one little mistake here. We didn't have Rabbi Yitzchak until now. Until now, we had a statement of Rabbi Shmuel, Rav Shmuel, correct? Just let me double check the names here for a split second. Rav Shmuel. Yeah, Rav Shmuel was only giving us the method by which we create the dye of tcheles and the chutim of tcheles. But now we're trying to point out that if you want to check and see whether the tcheles is real, genuine tcheles, or it's a fake, it's kala elon, we're quoting now Rabbi Yitzchak Bered Rabbi Yehuda to say that he'll teach us how to check and determine the authenticity of the tcheles. Maisi Magbia Gila Umaya Dishavlila Lilta. So Rashi identifies this Magbia as something called alum, and Gila is the sap of a fenugreek, umeme raglayim, and he would bring also urine. Here we have machlokes exactly what was the nature of that urine, because on the top of Hadaf for today, Mem Gimel, it says Ben Arboim Yom. So some say it's a child who's at least 40 days old. Others say that the urine has to be 40 days old. And Visari La Begavayu Me Urta Viad Safra. So the tcheles would be soaked in this concoction for what's called me'es la'es for a full 24 hours, and then he would check it out. Ifrad Chazuse, if he saw that the color of the thread started to fade as a result of this soaking for 24 hours in the concoction, then psula. Then he knows that this is not the real McCoy Coca-Cola, right? I mean, it's not the real tcheles, it's indigo. Velo ifrad chazuse, however, if the color of the tcheles as a result, even after all this soaking for 24 hours in a concoction did not fade, then kshera, he knows that this is the real genuine tcheles. Now the Gemara quotes another possible method of testing to determine whether this is genuine tcheles. Rav Ada kamei de Rav Ishmei de Rav Avira. Omar, he said the following: Maise, we bring chamira. Chamira is what's it called? Yeast. Arkisa de sari. Sari means barley, so it's talking about hard barley yeast. He puts the thread into this yeast, the ofile, and he bakes it. Begave, while the thread of so-called cheles, if it's real, genuine, is inside this yeast. And then we see, Ishtani Limal Yusa, if the color of the thread gets better, it's improved, then ksher, we know it's real tcheles. But Ligriusa, if its change is for the negative, it's detrimental, then it's psula, we cannot use it, it's disqualified. V'simonach, and just to remember it, if you need a mnemonic device, shinui sheker, right? If one lies for the worse, that's called sheker. But shinui emes, if one tries to change his words in order to make people feel happier, then it's true. But anyway, let's get back to the whole issue here. The Brisa says that there's no way of checking out cheles. Now we find not one, but even two methods that were employed by the Amoraim to check out and determine whether or not, after the examination, we could say this is real tcheles. So the Gemara reinterprets the Brisa, "Mai elo b'dika namika omar ateima." When the Brisa says that there's no method of examination to determine whether this is real tcheles, what it really was referred to is that when you dye this piece of cloth of wool for the purpose of testing, then you should know that right? I'm sorry. Start again. If you dye a piece of wool for purpose of testing the dye to see if the dye process is working, which is what we discussed earlier, and then the dyeing was done shalom lishma, then you cannot use any method of even determining for sure by examination that this is the real tcheles. It's not going to help you at all because it's te'ima. And anything that was done for te'ima purposes, that dyeing was not done lishma, and it can't be used for tcheles. Mar mashkene aise tchilta b'shani rav avachai. Now, who is this Mar Memashke? Apparently, his name was Mar, and he came from a town called Mashke, and he brought tcheles at the time of Rav Achai. Rav Achai lived after the period of the Amoraim. He was the first generation of what's called Sabroi, Chachmei Sabroi, and they were in charge of closing the Talmud. what's called Chasimas HaTalmud. So this Mar Mimashke from the town of Mashke brought Tcheles, and Badkuhu, they tested it. Rav Yitzchak Braid Rav Yehuda, first they used the first testing with that concoction, and Ifrad Chazuse, the color faded. So now it's a failed test. And yet, they tested it a second time, Bid Rav Ada, Vishtanim Lal Musa. They used Rav Ada's method, the second method of testing, and it improved, which means that it's not indigo, but rather it's tcheles, a real genuine tcheles. So the first test that failed was the test of Rav Yitzchak Bered Rav Yehuda, and that proved that it's not tcheles, therefore it must be indigo. The second test, it's proved it's successful. It's instead of getting worse, detrimental, it got better, and therefore we know that it is tcheles and it's not indigo. So we'd have a contradiction between two tests, whether it's indigo or it's not indigo. Several Mishle, so they thought since it failed the first test, we have to passel it. Amalu Rav Achai, but this Rav Achai, who, as I said before, was the first of the Chachmei Savroi, he said, Elacha lo tchilte v'lo kol ilanhi. How can you tell me that it's not tcheles and therefore it's possible when the second proof, the second examination proved that it's not indigo, but rather it's tcheles? So what is it? Is it a third kind of a dye that we're not aware of? Ella, but rather shma mina shmu osa hadodi itmar. Both these examinations, that of Rabbi Yehuda and that of Rav Ada, were given together. They're like piggybacked one on top of the other. Hey, if after the first test, using the methodology of Rabbi Yitzchak Rabbi Yehuda, it performed beautifully, and loi parid, there was no fading of the color, then we know for sure kshera. There's no doubt about it. Once you've passed the first test, you have absolutely established the kashrus of this tchelis. It's the real McCoy tchelis. However, if it fails the first test, iparid chazuse, and the color fades, then badkinin lahu b'rav abba b'chamira arkus. So we take that whole method, the hard barley yeast, and we insert the the dye into that yeast, and ishtani lal yusok kshera. And even though it had failed the first test of Rabbi Yitzchak Rabbi Yehuda, nevertheless, since it passed the second test of Ada, therefore it's kshera. But l'griyusa psula, if it fails not only the first test, but it also failed the second test with the barley yeast, then it is determined to be psula. So it'll only be possible if it fails both tests. Sholchu misam, and they wanted to support this statement of Rav Achai. So they sent a message from Eretz Yisrael, Shmu Osa Dodi Itmar. Rebbe Mani Dayik V'Sovin Kechumrei Mas Niyasa. Rav Mani was very strict, and he took the above brisos, and he came to the conclusion that therefore you can only buy thread that would be dyed for the purpose of tzitzis, and if the thread was dyed for the purpose of testing, it is unacceptable, and the tchelis has to be purchased from an expert. Amalehu Saba, some say it's Eliyahu Novi, Hachi Avud Kamoik de Kamoch. This indeed was the practice of your predecessors, the greats of the previous generation, the Atzlich Iskayu, and they were very successful, meaning he gave him the gushpanka, the approval that this chumrah was well based. Tana Rabbanu, we learned in the Braysa, Lokeach talis mitzuyetzes min hashuk. If a person goes and buys a talis and it has tchelis on it, if he bought it Yisrael from a Jew, Harei he b'cheskasa, we could assume that the Jewish buyer would not pull off a fake and sell you something that was that was not really tchelis, but it was dyed with indigo. But mina akum, if he buys it from an akum, then if the akum is a professional seller and he sells garments to Jewish people with, the assumption that this tchela, a real genuine tchelis, then kshera, we can rely on it because he wouldn't want to put his occupation at a risk. But min if you buy from a private person who couldn't care less whether he endangers his reputation, then psula, you don't know that this guy may have dyed the tcheles himself, which is shalol lishma, and if it's possible, or alternatively, maybe he's pointing you off with indigo, which is a lot cheaper than tcheles from chilazon. The afal pisha omru ein on the rashoy limkar talis mitzias lo v'kocho machiyat tzitziuso. The rule is that you're not allowed to sell a garment that has tzitzis on it, which means tcheles in the time of the tcheles, to a guy, to an idol worship. My timer, why don't you want to sell it to him? So the Gemara quotes two opinions. Chacha here, which probably refers to Bavel, right, here he says maybe it refers to Eretz Yisrael, I don't know. Anyway, Targimu, they explained, why don't you sell a full-fledged talis with tzitzis and tchelis on it to a guy, to an idol worshiper, mishum zona. And here we have machlokas, exactly what this opinion means, two interpretations of mishum zona. According to one interpretation, the guy now has a talis of tzitzis. He's going to approach a Jewish zona, and the zona is going to comply because she thinks he's Jewish. He's wearing tchelis. I guess even people who wore tchelis went to zonos. The other interpretation is that the zona will spread rumors about a certain Jew, saying that he came to consort with her because he wore tcheles, and that proves that he was a Jew, and that's going to spread rumors about the Jew. Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shema Yislava Imo B'derech V'Yargeu. Rabbi Yehuda was concerned with even a more radical kind of danger by selling a talis mitzuyetzes to a guy, an idol worship, because maybe he's going to join the Jew in a long journey, and the Jew thinks he's Jewish. He's going to put his guard down, and it could be that this guy will actually kill him. It sort of like reminds me of what, in our contemporary situation here in Israel, that if an enemy of the Jewish people is going to get a pair of tzitzis or whatever, maybe he'll steal, an army, a soldier's uniform. He can present himself as a Jew and get in, and then blow everybody apart. Rabbi Yehuda Rami Tchilta leParzuma the Inshe Beise. So Parzuma is a cloak, and it's got four corners, so it's chayav in tzitzis, and he would affix tzitzis for the benefit of his household members. And some say he was referring to his wife, meaning he was of the opinion that a woman is obligated in the mitzvah of tzitzis, umevarach kol tzafel is atif b'tzitzis. And nevertheless, even if a woman is obligated in tzitzis, which means it's a mitzvah seisha einaz man groma, which means that it's a perpetual 24/7 mitzvah that applies day and night, and therefore you would say that there's no point in which he has to make another bracha, but nevertheless he made a bracha every day. So the Gemara asks the following question: Mida Rami, since he affixed tzitzis to his wife's cloak, apparently he holds because our mitzvah seisha one groma. So Yechayv in tzitzis day and night 24/7. Is therefore Mayim Avar called Tzafra Tzafra. Right, the halacha is that if you have a mitzvah that's perpetual, you make the bracha once and it counts for the whole day. Like, for example, we make Birchas HaTorah in the morning and it counts for the whole day because the mitzvah is continuous. Tefillin is also a continuous mitzvah during the daylight hours, and therefore you make a bracha on the tefillin in the morning. And okay, we're going to soon see that if you take it off, that might terminate. But in any event, the Gemara says now that Rebbe is of the opinion that if you take off your tefillin during the day and you put them on again, you have to make another bracha. The Chacham disagree. Tisanya tefillin kol zman shemenicham v'varach aleim divrei Rebbe. Rebbe holds that you take off the tefillin, that's the end of your bracha. It's ended. Now you put on tefillin a second time during the same day, you have to make another bracha. And we're going to apply that to tzitzis according to Rav Yehuda. And we're going to say that Rav Yehuda, holding like Rebbe, would say that every time you take off your tzitzis and put it on again, you have to make another bracha. So the Gemara says, "Hachi kol shata nami." Why is it that Rav Yehuda made a separate bracha in the morning when he woke up, and that covered him for the entire day? Every time he takes off his tzitzis during the course of the day, if he holds like Rebbe in tefillin, he should be making another bracha. Why only in the morning? And Rav Yehuda, this is not a labdusha chiddush here, but this is a mitzias. The reality is, Rav Yehuda was a modest person. He put on a garment in the morning, and he wore it the whole day. When he went to sleep at night, right, he changed his garment, and he woke up in the morning with a new, the new day's garment, and therefore he would make another bracha. Umayshno mitzafra ki meshane miksus laila liksus yom. Why did he make a bracha in the morning? Because he put on his daytime clothing, took off his pajamas, and when he put on his daytime clothing, like the case of Rebbe, who every time he took off his tefillin and put it on again, he would make another bracha. He made a bracha in the morning. Tana Rabbanu, we learned in the Brisa, Kol Chayav Mitzitzis Kohanim, Levim, Yisraelim, Gerim, Noshim, Vavodim. Okay, so here we have again Noshim, because this reflects the sheet that we saw before, that tzitzis and mitzvah seisha einas groma, women are obligated. But you don't know why the Bryce had to tell me that Kohanim, Levim, and Yisraelim are obligated. Rabbi Shimon Poter Benoshim, Rabbi Shimon is of the opinion, Mipnei Mitzvah Seishman Gromahi, and called Mitzvah Seishman Gromanoshim Pturos. There's no mitzvah tefillin at night, and we're going to see how Rabbi Shimon derives that from the Pasuk Risim also. Omar Mar, we saw in this Bryce Hakol Chayav Mitzvahs Kohanim, Levim, Yisraelim Pshita, K'te'i Kohanim Levi Yisrael Pturim Michayev Man Chayev. Right, if you're going to tell me in the Havamina that we would say that Kohanim, Levim, Yisrael, Mapota, who's Chayav and Tzitzis? Kohanim, it's the Chiddush here is only that Kohanim, it's the Levim and Yisrael are brought Agav Urcha. Salke Daitkamina might think that only he, or I should say he, maybe that group of Jewish people that are subject to the law of Esei Dochalosa said that you wear tzitzis b'kalayim as a separate heter, which the Torah is matik dilim tasa l'cha, etc. Whole ksiv til b'shatnis 7 fish in the after gedilim tasa l'cha is man delo ishtri kalayim l'gabei v'levisha hu demachai b'tzitzis. A person who, in general, would be in violation of shatnis by wearing a combination of wool and linen, such a person gets the permission and therefore the obligation to put tcheles on his tzitzis. But hani kohanim hol ve'ishrei kelaim l'gabayu lo, right, in the Big Day Kahuna there was shatnez, and yet the Torah commands the Kohen to wear the Big Day Kahuna, and therefore we see that he's not included in the prohibition of kilayim. Is kamashmal and Tana therefore to tell me that no, that even Kohanim are chayav in tzitzis. Why? Nehi de ishrei be'idan avoda. There's no blanket heter for Kohanim to wear shatnez, but rather when they wear the begadim during the time of their avoda, when they're doing the avoda in the Mikdash, and the Big Day Kahuna that they're wearing on Makadsham, then we say that they are allowed to violate kilayim. But lo even avoda lo ishtri. Let's say they're not working and serving in the Mikdash, they have to change their Big Day Kahuna, because if they wear the Big Day Kahuna and they're not serving in the Mikdash, then they are violating kilayim. Rabbi Shimon Poter Benoshim, my time there, what's the source for Rabbi Shimon? This Tanya we learned, Rabbi Shimon is going to tell you, Risam also pratlik sus laila. So Re'isim also indicates that you will see the tzitzis, but at night nobody sees the tzitzis. You're wearing it in the privacy of your bedroom in your pajamas. Is therefore the night garment is potter. Now, this is very fascinating. I wish we had time for this. We don't. But if a garment is a night garment designated for nightwear, then Reb Shimon says you're potter. But many Rishonim will say that if you have a day clothing, like what we're wearing now during the day, then even at night you're chayiv in tzitzis. So Re'isim also is only telling you what kind of beged generates a chiv tzitzis, but that's enough to make the mitzvah saseh into a mitzvah saseh shazman groma. Because once there's an element of time that's factored into the mitzvah, that itself establishes the mitzvah shazman groma and patas up women. Ata omer prat l'ksus laila, and we're going to see that there's another shita here that maybe Re'isim also could possibly exclude Eino el prat l'ksus desuma, because a blind person doesn't see, so he's not included under Isim Osok. We have a special ribui to include a suma in the mitzvah of tzitzis. So the Gemara automatically, right? So now what do we do with Isim also, which we wanted to suggest should exclude the suma, but now we have a ribui for the suda shetachasava. Hamani mekai Isim also prat l'ksus slice. The Gemara says Mara Isa. Why do you use the ribui to include a suma and the miut to exclude a ksus laila? The rabbis ksus suma lo tzayim. Why not say punkfaker? Marbani ksus suma. Oh no, that's the Gemara's answer. So again, in the Gemara's question, Maroi is why not say punkfaker? Why not say that the ribui is coming to include a ksus laila and the miut is coming to exclude a ksus suma? At least the ksus of a suma, which he wears during the day, is seen by others. So there is a re'isim also, and therefore we have an inclination to want to include the suma. Nobody sees it when you go to sleep at night. Now, after all this, we have to ask ourselves the question: what do the Rabbanan do with these psukim, Urisim also, for example, that seems to indicate that a Beged Laila, Ksus Laila, should be potter?